right, everybody. Today we're dealing with the poverty trap. Okay. Whew. So I've ran this argument a few times lately, and I wanted to try and sketch this thing out in its fullest uninterrupted. When you're having a back and forth, it's a little hard to sort of lay out all your premises in a way that sort of makes sense. So there's this thing that's sort of endemic to, I think I'll say, liberals, conservatives, libertarians, pretty much anything to the right of being like a leftist or a progressive or something. And it's this idea that if you give people opportunities, they won't do it. It's fundamentally nihilistic, a very pessimistic outlook. That if you give people opportunities, some people just want to live in squalor. And that this population of people is very large. Now, are there some people who, if you gave them $400 a week, that they would just sit around and do literally nothing for the rest of their lives? Yeah, I'd say those people do exist. Maybe 1% of the population, 2% tops. It's a very low number in my estimation. When we talk about how, when you get this very like individualism focused mindset of, you could just make better decisions. You can just choose to be better. These are all choices people make, as if choices exist in a vacuum. And most people are going to be familiar with the criticism I'm going to make. Environment is predictive, blah, blah, blah. Most conservatives will probably be relatively unswayed by this argument, I would think. At least in the form it's usually presented. Like, you're born in poverty and blah, blah, blah. And poverty begets poverty. And this is true. But my goal in this video is to illustrate this point and to try and get people to empathize and understand this perspective by grounding it better than I think it usually is. You have to forgive me. I kind of threw this together in my head on my drive home from work. I knew roughly the sources I wanted to use because this is stuff I've all read and looked at before. And I knew roughly the time frame I wanted to do it. And there's this one story that I'm going to use. It's somewhat anecdotal. Not really anecdotal. But it's like a keystone example of the thing I'm trying to talk about here. So the argument that you generally hear from conservatives is that many of these people just, even if you give them second chances, they're just going to throw it away. Oh, if we give them educational opportunities, they're not going to take them. They could do them right now. When you give them housing assistance, they're just going to sit there and do nothing because you're giving them everything. And there's something to be said for how our system that's based around means testing can have inverse incentives in that respect. But that's not really what I want to talk about. I want to try and talk about how poverty is like a disease in a very real way. It's a phrase that's thrown around colloquially because obviously poverty is not literally a disease, but it has correlated comorbidities, diseases that are comorbidities with poverty that are very, very real, that impact your ability to live. So I want to first start with what to try and get whoever's listening to this to try and understand what would it feel like to be constantly inundated with poverty and despair. Now, I want people to think of some things like when you sat through a bad job interview that you just knew was not going right. So you're sitting there for 30, 45, 60 minutes getting asked questions, and you just know, like, they're asking you these questions and they don't care about your answers, and you're just wasting your time, and this was a job you really wanted, and you just know you're not going to get it. Or when you're rushing to finish that work assignment that's on a deadline, that school assignment that's on a deadline, and you just know that you don't have the time to submit the product that you want or to even complete the assignment at all. And you know you're fucked. It's that pit in your stomach that you can just feel that sits there. And those things are temporary. But imagine, like I'm sure many people who are watching this have probably been depressed at one point in your life. Maybe you're depressed right now. We are living through a pandemic. And you've probably felt that feeling of hopelessness, like can't even get out of your bed. Life doesn't feel like it's worth living. Your dreams are not achievable. Everything's just too fucking hard. And sometimes you get out of that. Sometimes you sit in that funk for a while. Sometimes it gets a little bit better. Sometimes you just fully leave that. Poverty is like living in that for your entire life. It's that scent, that pit in your stomach that's there in every interaction you do, that just sits in the back of your fucking head. It's equivalent probably more to depression than those momentary instances. But for those who didn't experience depression, I want to include those other things that could help you understand the way that feels. Or like, for my poker players, when you go heads up, you go all in pre-flop, and then you flip over your cards, you realize you're fucking dominated ace queen versus ace king, and you just know you're boned, or ace queen versus ace king. It's that thing that just sits there, and you just know you're fucked. But instead of being over in an hour in the case of a job interview, in a minute in the case of a poker hand, it's just there, omnipresent, looming over you at any given moment. It's something that's really hard to appreciate. I want to discuss like a few things. First, we're going to start with a little history lesson. So there's this cool article. I actually came across this in a book the first time I ever read about it. And the article, this article is titled "How a Worm Gave the South a Bad Name." And it's about hookworms. For those who are unfamiliar with hookworms live in moist environments. I'm going to paraphrase this article a little bit because I'm going based off a book I read, but this article talks largely about it, but doesn't have the exact story that I'm going to reference, which I think is based on Pedro Campos, but I couldn't find it in here, so I'm not going to 100% say that. Pedro Campos, super interesting character. He's like a Puerto Rican, I guess I'll say revolutionary. That seems fair. Independent, part of the Puerto Rican independence movement. But we'll go back to hookworm. Hookworm generally exist in moist, humid environments, i.e. the American South, where slaves were formerly kept, and islands like Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, all those places in Central, South America, and the Southern United States. Now, hookworms are not native to the Southern United States, but they are brought there from places that we, brought some people over from, we'll say, forcefully immigrated from. Slaves. I'm talking about slaves. That we brought slaves to this country. And with them, we brought hookworms. So after the Civil War, the average American Southerners, a lot of people know this already, but not everyone in the South was like rich white slaveholders. Many people owned slaves, like about 1/3 of the population or 1/2 of the population owned slaves. Most of them just owned like one slave, and then you had those rich plantation owners who were the haughty-taughty antebellum South, the typical image you think of that. After the Civil War, during Reconstruction, the South was in tatters, and I'm going to use Pedro as a stand-in here. It might have been someone else, but I'm pretty sure it was Pedro Campos. So this was like well into construction, like 1890s or something like that. Let's see what year he was born. Let's double check that. It could not have been the 1890s because he was born in 1891. So we'll say the 1920s because I don't remember the specific year. Should have reread this story real quick, but I was on my way home from work, so I wanted to kind of get this out. So he's there with his northern. Pedro went to Harvard, and during one of their like recesses, he went with one of his classmates, and they traveled to the South, and they see these decrepit-looking people, physically ill, physically weak. They look meek. They look defeated. Their bodies just look like these like incestuous, destroyed, disgruntled people. They look like baby Voldemort, just they're weak. They can't even stand this. The actual strength of them is just sapped from them. Okay, and his northern friend is like, look at these people, these Southerners. They're just incapable of working hard. You can just see it in them. And then Pedro, being someone from Puerto Rico, is like, you think this is like endemic to these people, that these people are just incapable of working hard, and like it's reflective in like their physical condition. They just look like people who are incapable, who are soulless, who are just sapped of strength. They're gaunt. And Pedro's like, you fucking idiot. This is hookworms. They have hookworms. Pedro, I believe, was a doctor. And like through efforts later on, the South was overrun with this super cheap medicine that kills hookworms. Now, the reason hookworms were prevalent in the South was to a variety of reasons. One, the way hookworms get into you is when you're walking around barefoot in wet and moist areas. They enter through your feet, so they leave a distinctive mark in the soles of your feet. So they have they call it like an itch as like they're entering you. It's explained in this article, but I'll link it below for those interested in reading more. But yeah, so when you don't have shoes, when you go to the bathrooms outdoors, because they reproduce through your poop, so people just shitting outdoors in outhouses or just in the grass and stuff like that, this perpetuates the growth of hookworms. The South after Reconstruction was ripe for the conditions to perpetuate hookworms. And this played into the lazy Southerner stereotype that people even still today talk about, because hookworms made these people look gaunt, unpresentable, unmotivated, and they looked like, I want to say devilish. It's not really a word. Like soulless. Like the strength has been sapped out of them, because it quite literally was. Because in those Reconstruction years, many of them were experiencing immense poverty. Hookworms were rampant, and you'd see these dejected people everywhere. When the South was flooded with this low-cost treatment for hookworm, guess what? Miraculous. These people all recovered. You know why? Because there's nothing endemically wrong with these people. They had hookworms, a plague on poor people everywhere, where it makes it so, yes, you literally don't have the strength to work because the hookworms are sapping all the strength from you. So it's weird how the entire North thought these Southerners are just so lazy. The Reconstruction is just going to yield like no positive results because like these people are just lazy and unmotivated and not capable because they're from bad stock or whatever the rationale is. And this was not just about black people. This was about like the lazy Southern whites and stuff like that. In actuality, it was hookworm. And once you address the hookworm, it turns out everything else kind of went away with it. Oh, they started working hard. They were able to industrialize, blah, blah, blah. Because it was like 30 or 40% of their population that was affected by it. And it still affects many people to this day. But it was particularly bad there. I'm trying to see if it says the numbers here. As recently as the 1950s, let's see. Southern fondness for hookworms. Shouldn't get distracted. Die within the guts. Up to 4% of population stretching from southeastern Texas to West Virginia. Hookworms. Wait. Culprit behind the germ of laziness was the South. Okay, I'll just read this whole paragraph. The culprit behind the germ of laziness, as the South's fiction was sometimes called, was Necatar americanus, the American murderer, better known today as hookworm. Millions of these blood-sucking parasites lived, fed, multiplied, and died within the guts of up to 40% of the population stretching from southeastern Texas to West Virginia. Hookworms stymied development throughout the region and bred stereotypes about lazy, moronic Southerners. This is what we're talking about. When you have malnutrition that can be caused by stuff like hookworms, it impedes your development like permanently when you're young. Just like malnutrition does today to anybody, whether that's caused by hookworms, whether that's caused by food deserts, or whether that's caused by literal just starvation. That drives all of these characteristics we're talking about. So let's compare this to like modern day poverty. You see the same arguments tried out that these are just lazy, moronic, poor people who choose to make bad decisions because whatever. And when we look at some of these things that we're going to talk about here, let's start with obesity. Let's talk about, we got the wrong link there. That's the wrong one. Should have prepared slightly better, but that's okay. Do I not have that here? I just want to look at the obesity link here. Did I really not pull that out? Oh, okay. This one talks about how geographic association between income inequality and obesity among adults in New York. Spoiler, when you're poor, you're more likely to be obese. That sounds weird. How can poor people afford to overeat? It's well, because overeating is interesting. One, when you live in these poor, impoverished areas, I mean, most of us have been to McDonald's. You can get like a decent sized meal, fill you up, give you like 1,000, 1,200, 1,500 calories for like $4. You know, you get one of those like crave packs from like Wendy's. It'll be like 1,200 calories, a little cheeseburger, nuggets, fries, drink, all that. That shit's really easy to come by in low-income areas like oh shoot, I'm trying to remember, Oakland, Compton? I think I'm thinking of Compton. Compton's out in Los Angeles, I'm pretty sure. Compton is a food desert. It's weird. You think food deserts, that would be like, you know, rural areas. Nope, they exist in cities too. Compton is a suburb or a city in southern Los Angeles, and Compton is a food desert. When you're in one of these low-income areas like Compton, you can't come by fresh, nutritious food. All you have access to is convenience stores that have processed, poorly nutritious food. You have fast food like Wendy's, McDonald's, you know, Taco Bell's, all that stuff. That's what these people eat because they just don't have access to other stuff, and it's cheap. Like when you try and eat healthy, like this is one of the things I always run into. I go to Wendy's, eat for $4. If I want to get a nice salad from someplace and try and eat a little healthier, it's going to cost me $12. I want to get some salmon, probably going to cost me at least $15, $18, $20. But eating a $4 meal from Wendy's will fill me up, it'll taste okay, but it will kill you. It drives poverty, drives obesity. And another fun statistic that's pointed out, which hopefully many people will be familiar with, is the 1350 meme. 13% of the population, i.e. black people, or 13% of the population, commit 50% of the murders. One of the recent videos I talked about how For most people, murder is not that relevant of a statistic. Black people doing 50% of the murders, also really not relevant because most people don't live near black people. That's what ghettos are for. Black people live near other black people, kill other black people. Doesn't really affect the average citizen. It's rolled out generally as a defamatory smear. But what's interesting is that no one talks about during this pandemic is this fun little statistic from the CDC, which I scrolled past before. COVID-19 hospitalizations, black people are 3.7 times more likely. Hispanic people, 4.1 times more likely to be hospitalized. This is compared to white, non-Hispanic people. That's the baseline. So they're nearly 4 times, if you're black or Hispanic, we're just going to average it, about 4 times more likely to be hospitalized due to COVID-19. If you're black or Hispanic, you're 2.8 times more likely to die of COVID-19. There's a fun stat that got floated around, I believe it was like a month ago. I'm sure it hasn't improved. 0.1% of black people have died to COVID-19 so far during this pandemic. Sounds like a small number until you extrapolate that to 40 million people. Then that number becomes quite a bit more significant. This is bad. And the reason people don't talk about this is because it undermines that narrative of, these people are just lazy, they're just unmotivated, they just don't make good decisions. Well, these aren't decisions that are made in vacuums. I sort of alluded to this earlier. The poverty that afflicts them leads to stuff like obesity, which is risk factors for development, cognitively, which is a risk factor for COVID-19. It's weird how there's overlap there. But no one seems to talk about all the dead black people from COVID-19, but we do talk about all those murder rates and all those shootings and stuff. It's almost like it's slightly motivated. So you have this where you can't eat nutritiously, and I know, sometimes when I want to go to the gym or whatever, I'm like 31 years old now. If I eat fast food, after I eat fast food, I'll feel like shit for 2 fucking days. I can't even get up. But if I have a nice fresh salad, I'll feel full. I'll be like, oh, today's the day we go for a run, my fat ass, we're gonna get on the treadmill, we're gonna run out. Well, not treadmill, I run outside, but point stance. You get out and you go and do stuff. Just ignoring that pit, the literal pit in your stomach, though, the weight of that greasy, processed, disgusting food sitting within you, making it hard for you to do stuff. It's also literally killing you by clogging your arteries, increasing obesity rates in these communities, making it overall not very great to grow up in. Then we compound this with stuff like poor access to education. I actually don't have a link here, but we're going to talk about education anyway. Education in many, many states, I'm not going to say every single state because I don't know how every single state functions, is funded through local property taxes. And there's the kicker to that. If your property taxes are high, i.e. if the housing value is high, i.e. it's a desirable place to live, your schools end up being better. I went to a place where people paid an average of $12,000 a year in property taxes. Guess what? My public schools were really fucking good. If you go to a place where the average property taxes are like $500 or $1,000 or something like that, guess what? Your schools are going to be shit because they're just not going to get the adequate funding that they need. So you have all the circumstances compounding. Your opportunities are lacking. There was a school district one town over from where I lived, where they had a 5-year graduation rate. They literally couldn't provide enough classes for kids to graduate in 4 years from high school. It took them 5. So kids would have, 8 periods in a high school. 4 of them would be lunches sometimes because they just couldn't. They literally, or not lunches, but lunches in study halls and study hall where you do literally nothing. Literally couldn't provide the credits required for these kids to graduate on time. Meanwhile, my school is offering advanced placement classes. My sister left left high school with 1 year of college done. 1 entire year. That saves you $30,000 if you go to a out-of-state school, which she did. And it saved her $30,000 not to have to be there for an additional year. That's a pretty cool advantage to have, tied to those healthcare, the access to good education. Now, what else ties into that? Well, let's talk about the prison industrial complex. Here's some fun facts. If you are imprisoned, your income goes down by 52%. That's over half of your lifetime earning. Average earning losses vary by level of criminal justice involvement. If you are imprisoned, you lose 52% of your income. If you have a felony conviction without imprisonment, that's 22% of your income. If you have a 16% misdemeanor conviction, 16% loss for a misdemeanor conviction. Now, how does that, let's see, percent of black people who have felonies. Study estimates U.S. population with felony convictions. Let's see. I actually don't know this off the top of my head, but I can tell you this. I know it's going to be disproportionate. I feel like it's going to be about 30-40%. People with felony convictions more broadly account for 8% of the overall population and 33% of the African-American male population. Interesting. Why do they count for 33% of the African American population? Weird. It's almost like this stuff all plays into one another. Now, that might be a video for a separate time where we talk about how, prison and penalizing has been used to oppress the black population or undesirable groups, particularly black people, for the past 150 years in this country. Well, I guess we kind of addressed it. You have convict leasing. We'll just go over quickly. You have convict leasing. You have Jim Crow laws. You have, after the civil rights movement, we just moved into mass incarceration, which, weirdly enough, like before the Civil Rights Act, black people couldn't vote. They couldn't go to certain places, and they couldn't work in certain places. And then after the Civil Rights Act, well, we strapped them with the felony label, and now they can't vote in many places. In Florida, I think we have 1.5 million people who we don't let vote. Half of those people, I think 700,000, are black. Even though only, I think it's like 18% of our population is black. But half of our incarcerated or our non-voting population, due to felonies, is black. Very curious. Not very curious at all. There's plenty of evidence indicating it's... I'll go over that again. It was based on the follow-up from the conversation I had with Destiny, where I wanted to talk about how the war on drugs was manufactured, where him and I got off topic on that, so I'll have to make another video about that. But yeah, when we cranked up our war on drugs and subsequently increased our prison population. So before the war on drugs in about the 1970s, we had about 180,000 people incarcerated in this country in state and federal prisons and jails. After the war on drugs, we have like 2.2 million. And we've been floating around that same number for about the last 20 years or so. We increased our prison population over 30 years, over tenfold, with predominantly by over-policing black and brown areas for reasons, which once again we'll go into that other video. But either way, we have areas that are being overly targeted, who are afflicted by poverty, who are more prone to heart disease, malnutrition, driving, developmental issues and health issues, which all compound into one another, that drive your predisposition towards diseases like COVID-19. Which compound with lack of educational or success opportunities due to lack of jobs in an area, lack of role models due to the low-income areas you're in, with lack of educational opportunities due to the poor funding of your schools, which also then compound with a criminal justice system designed to put more people into the system because it's profit-driven in large parts. When you give lots of money, when you fire a money cannon at police institutions, they tend to like having more employees who are better armed, more officers who have more resources, who get more overtime for enforcing drug laws, which is how we incentivize that in the 1980s underneath Reagan for no fucking reason against the initial will of the police. So I guess we'll try and wrap this up right now. Anything else I wanted to talk about? I think I kind of worked through most of my points I was going to make. Right. Poverty is endemic. Just like hookworms made Southerners look bad, hookworms relating to poverty made Southerners look like shit after the Civil War, even though they weren't. You have poverty today, which will incessantly drive home this idea of lazy people who just don't want to be better, because we take that individualist focus, that individualist lens, to try and demonize these people for doing the bad thing. When in reality, we've put all the conditions in place to nearly guarantee failure. People getting out of it, the reason we allowed people who fought their way out of poverty is because they're the exception. Because it's so incredibly surprising that someone was able to fight through that poverty, get out of it, and come out the other side alive. Because we know all this stuff. We know how the prison industrial complex has ravaged these low-income, typically brown and black communities. And this affects everybody, not just black people. It affects all poor people. It's just black people and brown people tend to be disproportionately poor compared to white people. That's why that's used as a baseline. Oh, that was a fun one too. Black people without a record on average make $39,000 a year, while white people with a record on average make $49,000 a year. Very interesting. This is from the Brennan Center, by the way. Usually pretty good for doing fun little studies and infographics like this. The point I'm trying to get across is that if you don't realize how deterministic environments are, you're denying an overwhelming cornucopia of evidence that has previously been used to demonize people all throughout history. The prominent example I used was hookworms in the South just being written off because when we're seeing what we want to see, the Northerners didn't think too highly of the Southerners for a litany of reasons. But when they saw them looking impoverished, looking gaunt, looking helpless, looking completely sapped of energy, strength, and soul, They just said that's just how those people are. They just want to live like that. And doesn't that sound familiar that we said these white, poor Southerners who were ravaged by a civil war, who were left without economic opportunity, fell into this immense despair, and ultimately were ravaged by something like hookworm. And then today, we have the same exact thing happening to impoverished people in our country. So my answer to that question is ultimately no. When you give people, opportunity, they want to act on it. When you sap people of all the opportunities, you can't be surprised when they fall into these, I don't want to say diseases of despair, but that might be accurate, the sense of like social depression, where their ability to succeed just seems so monumental that it's not worth the ask. You know, if you try and go get a job, oh, you got a felony, you're just going to make less, you can get less jobs, or you don't have a felony, and then it's harder for you to get a job for a variety of reasons, such as the name study where black people just get called back less for job interviews. The jobs in your area don't pay well, and there aren't too many, or all of these things just add up to one another to where you just go, fuck it. And you succumb to this general sense of malaise, this hopelessness, this defeatedness. And that is the trap of poverty. I opened with a clever video title for that. I don't remember what it was, but the trap of poverty, where it gets you in there and it's nearly impossible to get out. And it's always been a thing, and it'll always be a thing. And people just trying to justify reality as it is through some weird, like, oh, you can't have this wide-eyed belief that people will just do the right thing. They'll just want to improve their conditions. That's not the wide-eyed view. The stupid, ignorant, like, realpolitik view of, oh, people just want to be lazy and useless and not do anything and be criminals and not contribute to society. That's the ignorant, stupid view. It's just lazy pseudo-intellectuals who want to justify the world as it is, who are blinded by the clear evidence that's in front of your face if you want to look for it. The answers are there. The historical trends are there. If you want to deny them, you're a liar, or you're ignorant, or you're otherwise motivated. But well, the point here was to try and create like a convincing argument on why poverty is the main driver here. And start with that anecdote, because I think everyone can understand how this stereotype literally exists to today. Lazy Southerners is a meme today, and this has been around for over 100 years. How can we be surprised that black people who were, slaves, who are viewed as infantile in nature, would get this same exact view that we have of them today? How, like, you think just if we give black people birth control that they'll use it? Yes, the studies indicate that. You think if we give them job prospects, they'll use them and not go back to a life of crime? Yes, the studies indicate that. None of these things are surprising. None of it's idealistic. It's all driven by pragmatic, evidence-based research. The thing that's not driven by pragmatic, evidence-based research is the baseless nihilism that justifies the hellscape that we live in, that we let like half of our country live in, through not having basic access to education opportunities, to nutritious food, to all of these things that make it possible for people to have hope and to have hope and to have access to opportunities that allow them to act on that hope. Okay? And with that, we're going to end this video because I am tired and I would like to go to sleep. I love and respect you all.